Chapter 9, how government intervention impacts competitive markets. So how do we go about analyzing those interventions? A government can intervene when it sees that there is a market failure, or when it wants to provide a minimum support level of what the price of certain goods and products would be, like let's say agriculture, or it wants to provide the maximum price at which something should be sold. So if it wants to set up a floor or a ceiling, then government can intervene. So when government intervenes by setting up these artificial prices, how does the market behave? So to understand that, let's go over and understand some of these concepts first. What is a consumer and a producer surplus, right? So assuming demand and supply, your price is on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. This blue area, that's your consumer surplus. Basically, this is the surplus that your consumer enjoys for the price that they are paying, right? So let's take an example. Let's say you are a producer who is producing quantity Q1, right? At this quantity, this person here is willing to, because it's the demand curve, is willing to give you this price. But how much would you charge them? You would only charge them this price, which is much lower. You will charge them equilibrium price when they are willing to pay you a much higher price. Like all of these people are willing to pay you higher price, but you will charge them an equilibrium price because that's where your demand curve intersects your supply curve. So this is what you charge for P star. So when you charge a lower price than what they are willing to pay you, that's a surplus for them. They're enjoying freely your lower price. And so that's how we call this consumer surplus. It's the surplus that these consumers at these price points were willing to pay you a much higher price, but you were okay charging a lower price. Similarly, what's a producer surplus? It's this area, right? You have decided to charge P star, which is a much higher price than all of these points here, right? So that's your producer surplus. You're charging much higher than what all of these people are willing to pay you, right? So that's what you would enjoy as a producer on the supply side. So supply side surplus starts from the supply curve, or the producer surplus starts from the supply curve, and the demand curve in below has the consumer surplus. So does that make sense? So I'm marking them specifically here. So once we understand, okay, what is the surplus that the consumer is enjoying, what's the surplus that the producer is enjoying, we can then you can measure these two things to say, hey, when there is a government intervention, what is the change in this blue area or this red area? And that study is called welfare effects. Study of these changes, gains and losses to producer and consumer surpluses is welfare effects, right? And there may be times when some of these changes actually causes a net loss, meaning this area now shrunk. We will look at some of these examples, but that's what's called the deadweight loss, when there's a net loss either to the producer or the consumer. Yeah. So we understand supply and demand. We understand how we can get the consumer surplus, how we can get the producer surplus. Yeah. See, here the price is much higher, and you're getting that surplus as a producer. Yeah? Okay. So we understand consumer producer surplus. Now intervention could be that the government puts a price above this market clearing price, the equilibrium price, right? This is your equilibrium price, the supply and demand meet. They could put a price tag, that says, hey, I have this price that's much higher than the price that you have as market clearing price. I'm going to call it the price floor, right? So they could set up a floor, meaning, hey, this is the minimum price. It cannot be this price, right? So anything above this price is okay, but not below this price. So that's a floor. Similarly, your government can say, hey, no, this price is way too high. I want to set up a ceiling, which is a price much lower than your equilibrium price. It says, hey, no, this price cannot go above this point. Yeah? So it say, hey, anything less is okay, so that's the maximum price, and this is the minimum price, right? So government can intervene with various measures to, with legislative action or some ways in which it could, buy up excess supply that's available. Government can intervene and set up these floors and this ceiling. So now let's look at that here. This chart is when the price is above the equilibrium price, P star, Q star, and this price is below. I've just redrawn it here. This orange line, in this case, is a price floor, and in this case, the orange line is below the equilibrium price, so it's the price ceiling, right? So it's called the price floor because that's the minimum price. Anything above this floor, anything above the floor is okay, so it's called the floor price. Anything below the ceiling is okay, so it's called the ceiling price. So that's the max price, right? So when you have an equilibrium point and the price is above, it's the floor price. Anything above is good. When you have the equilibrium point above your price that the government sets, it's your ceiling price. Anything below is good. Yeah? Okay, so now let's see what happens to the impact to this blue area and this red area when the price floor is set. Meaning P1 is set, which is much higher than P star and Q star, your equilibrium price for demand and supply. So then what happens? As we see here, when this price is set, it's going to intersect with this demand, and we will see that the overall consumer surplus reduced, right? What happened? Initially, these two were also blue, but now it's reduced, right? And what happened to your consumer surplus? These consumers now, instead of selling at P star, they are able to sell at P1, which is much higher. So what are they going to do? They are going to be able to sell much higher quantity, ideally, right? But your consumers are going to demand much less. So what happened is, at this point, right, when we see this intersection, this price will go here, and so your new price would be P1 and Q1, right? Because ideally, if you assume whatever is demanded is what is supplied, meaning although you could supply much higher quantity, you would not do it because there is no demand for it. And so what happened is this becomes your producer surplus now. So initially, this was part of red, and this was part of blue, and this was part of blue. So now producer surplus, this blue is now red, you see? This was initially blue, now it's red, so I'm going to mark it red, right? So this is now your producer surplus. So we see the producer surplus increasing, in this case, consumer surplus reducing. And we also see this area, which was initially, this was part of consumer surplus, this was part of producer surplus, it's now just lost, meaning it's dead weight. There was an opportunity that's lost, so this is lost. Meaning neither the producer is enjoying it, nor your consumer is enjoying it, and so this is the dead weight. This two triangles, or this big triangle, is your dead weight that we learned. Yeah? Okay, So we learn about like what happens to price floor. Consumers, in this case, had a surplus that they transferred some of it to producers, and so they saw their surplus reducing. Producers enjoyed price floor, right, in this case. So now let's say price ceiling, meaning anything below this price is okay, above is not okay, right? And so then what happens? So our equilibrium was here, Q star, P star, and now we have this new price level, and so it's going to intersect with your demand curve here and supply curve here. So now what happened is you just increased the demand quite a bit, but how much can you really supply, right? You increased from Q star to Q max, but what's happening is the price is now reduced. The demand went up, but now all of a sudden your suppliers surplus reduced quite a bit because that's all they can afford, this much, right? And your consumers surplus increased. It was initially this triangle and this, now it's this area, and then this part is the dead weight. This big part is the dead weight. Yeah, so we see how this works. Basically, this becomes an expanded expanded consumer surplus, reduction in producer surplus. Yeah, does that make sense? When you set a price below what it takes for supply and demand to meet, the producers are going to suffer. Their surplus is going to be eroded, it's going to be dead weight, but your consumers are going to be very happy because their surplus increased. So now we see how like setting price above and below, how it changes what your consumers enjoy and what surplus your producers enjoy. Right? And net, whatever changes we do, delta C, consumer surplus, and delta P, if you add them up, that's your total welfare. That has to be net positive. Then otherwise you should just leave the market to perform on its own, meaning have the supply meet the demand and let that be the clearing price. Why go ahead and reduce the welfare when there is price equilibrium that the market can figure out, and you're doing this price setting which actually hurts your market. So then the question is like, why even do all of these things, right? Well, this is important for government to sometimes intervene and say, hey, there is a higher price that we need to adhere to, right? Or a lower price, right? This is like the ceiling, right? Anything below this is okay, or anything above this is okay, yeah? So basically when this happens, government is trying to intervene and factor in the externalities. Like if a company produces things that has an impact on the environment, and so what does the government want to do then? Right? It wants to bake in and penalize those producers to factor in those externalities. So the government wants to come in and set some sort of a floor price. Let's say when it finds out that hey, certain agricultural products will go out of being produced or farmed because there is no floor to support them. Right? And if there is certain ceiling, then it also reduces the incentive for these producers who are producing waste to the environment. So it's going to help incentivize and make their surplus go down and make sure that those producers are producing lesser quantity. Otherwise, it could have a big impact. So government intervention at times is needed to support and to also disincentivize certain companies from doing bad things. So intervention is important, otherwise leads to market failure, where the capital stock of the country erodes over time and the externalities are not factored in. So we understand like there are two types of interventions. How we can measure it with consumer surplus and producer surplus, and as we can imagine, like this is like both of these curves, demand and supply curves, are like having equal slope. But you could imagine that, hey, you could have a demand curve that's much more inelastic, meaning it has a slope that's much more higher than the supply curve, or vice versa. Your supply curve could be like much more inelastic than the demand curve. So depending on the elasticity, you could see a big shift, right, in price and quantity reduction. So let's say the government, so we understand that, yeah, which is depending on the slope of your lines, elasticity, higher the inelasticity, the lower will be the drop in prices, and vice versa, right? So now let's take an example to really understand like this part of change in price and quantity, how they are going to change very differently based on elasticity of supply and demand. So we'll understand this based on an example. Let's imagine the government introduces a tax, and you're, let's say, building this pen. Your company is building this pen and said, hey, starting tomorrow, your company has to pay $1 tax for every unit that you sell. So it's going to say, hey, incremental tax of +1, right? So let's say it introduces tax for you, yeah? When it introduces tax for you, you have your supply and demand, let's say they are of the equal slope, then there will be an equal proportion change. But now let's imagine your demand curve is highly inelastic, right? And so it has a much steeper slope compared to your supply curve. You see it's much more flatter, right? And let's assume that now this T is the tax that's introduced. And in this case I've said T is 1 unit. So let's imagine this is 1 unit change. So what happens is then you will have to draw a 1 unit, a perpendicular line between your supply and demand, which is 1 unit. And so you will get 2 points, right? So initially your equilibrium was here, but now look what happened, right? If you have to pay this tax, your quantity would go down and your price would go up quite a bit, right? Price went up quite a bit, quantity went down a little bit. Price went up quite a bit from P star to P, let's say, tax, P tax, right? So Q star went to QT, small reduction in quantity, but a big increase in price, right? Similarly, if you had assumed in this case, your case had a supply curve that's highly inelastic, meaning a much steeper supply curve, instead of being flat, it's much steeper, and your demand curve is much more flatter. And so then if you have to have a 1 unit of tax, what you start to see is that your quantity goes down quite a bit, right? But your price only goes down a little bit, right? Price goes up a little bit. So you see the magnitude here is much bigger than the magnitude here, because that's the change that's going to happen for your equilibrium price now to change, yeah? So the key thing to keep in mind here is based on the slope or the inelasticity, higher the inelasticity, the steeper the slope, higher the change, yeah? So you want to look at the slope and actually see what's the magnitude change. So that's how we look at inelasticity of supply and demand. And we went through this where we set up a floor, price floor. But in a sense, how does the government actually set a price floor? The way they do it is they actually buy, to move this price to a higher price, government introduces this new demand. Instead of your equilibrium demand D1 and supply S1, government adds a new demand, meaning it buys out all of that, it buys out excess, and it becomes a new consumer of your good. And so what happens is your equilibrium price from P star to Q star, which was your demand and supply, now happens to be Q2 and PS, right? The support price. Support price is nothing but like, hey, I'm gonna provide this floor or this support or this floor, and when that happens, your quantity goes up, price goes up as well, yeah? So now all of a sudden you move your equilibrium price from P star to Q star, and then that excess quantity the government can do something about it, right? So what happened here with your consumer surplus, right? So delta CS is consumer surplus. So initially your consumers had this surplus with me, A and B, yeah? With this change, the surplus became this, because now that's the new price. And so what happened is consumers lost A and B, which is A is here, B is here, right? And when this price went up, the producers started to, it was initially, this is what your producers were initially, but then it also got the advantage of this new price, so the producers now benefited, meaning there was a transfer of A and B from consumers to producers, and an additional D that the producers also got, right, which is this part. So when government has to do this, right, it has to pay the price, because it all of a sudden is introducing this demand. So what's the price the government is paying? It's this quantity Q2 minus QS times PS. That's the price that government is paying for this excess demand. So you can calculate change in consumer surplus, change in producer surplus, cost to the government, and if there's any dead weight, you can calculate the dead weight as well. So now let's say the New York taxi example. And in that, what happens is you have your demand and supply, but supply is now automatically constrained with a quota, meaning there's a fixed quota. And when you add this fixed quota, your equilibrium price all of a sudden shoots up quite a bit, right? So this is what your equilibrium price was. Quantity is fixed to quantity quota fixed, and then the price significantly goes up, right? From P star to Q star, because that's where your supply intersects your demand. So what happened here? Initially, your producers were having this surplus, right? All of this. And your consumers were having all of this surplus. But then the consumer surplus, actually this is producers, and so consumer surplus now reduced quite a bit. It's now only just this much, meaning they lost A and B. Consumers lost A and B, which was initially part of the blue, and producers lost C, which was part of that as well. And you can see that B and C was lost by both of them, right? And producers now lost C, but they and consumers lost B, and so the dead weight is going to be B plus C. Yeah. So similarly, if we now, let's say you have this concept of tariffs and quota. If you want to look at an equilibrium price, U star, E star, and let's say this is equilibrium for your demand and supply. And let's say now you are able to produce at P star, but the world is able to produce at much lower price. You're able to produce at P star, but the world is able to produce at a much lower price. So what then happens is you can only supply this much, because then the world, people around the world will, supply it at a much cheaper price, which is PW. So what happened is you can only now, because the world price is cheaper and there's free imports, your price, domestic price, P star, will go down to PW, and your quantity domestically will reduce from Q star to QW, and because there is a higher demand, there will be imports. So Q import will be QI minus QW will be the import, right? This much. That's going to be imported. This is going to be domestic supply. This is going to be imported. So we can see that the world price, if it's lower than what it takes to produce domestically, then your price will go down. Your producer surplus will, the producer surplus should be red, just to stay consistent, goes down, right? Because now all of a sudden the world producers take over and they'll supply at a much lower price. So what happens is governments can introduce tariffs, meaning they could say, hey, I'm gonna charge for every import that you import, and so that what happens is the actual price of that item that's imported is going to go up. When that price goes up, all of a sudden you could start to see your quantity goes up and your price now becomes higher as you expect. So introducing tariffs or additional cost that the government can charge, or restricting quota, which is saying, hey, I'm only going to allow you to have these many items imported, are ways in which you could reduce import to all the way zero. If your quota is like, hey, 0 is my quota, then you're going to have a tariff that's equal to the delta. So what happens here is your consumers are going to lose big time. Your producers locally will get a boost with this tariff because now suddenly they can sell at those higher prices. But you could all the way go down to 0 imports, meaning you just don't allow imports. That's also possible. And typically tariffs would be much more cheaper, and the textbook goes into the general use case than using quotas. And so that's another deeper dive, or like a general use case of not going down all the way to 0, but like going to some arbitrary level which you're okay with for certain items to be imported. So this gives us a high level overview of the key things to remember here is this concept of producer surplus, consumer surplus, how interventions of price floors and price ceilings impact producer surplus, consumer surplus, and how there's dead weight, an opportunity just lost, meaning neither your producers are happy and consumers are happier. As long as the intervention is positive, it's important. Government would want to intervene and understand what those intervening steps are causing by looking at how steep your supply and demand curves are, how much inelastic they are, because then you would actually know whether what you're taxing is going to keep your producers and consumer with a net welfare positive or a net welfare negative. And you can do that, these kind of price floor and price ceilings, by eating up the government taking up excess supply or adding more demand, introducing tariffs and quotas, and how prices can be moved back up with use of tariffs and quotas. Chapter 9, nailed it.